On October 19, 1781, the British garrison at Yorktown surrendered to George Washington and his French allies. That moment marked the culmination of the Yorktown campaign, the last major American military action of the war. However, Washington's greatest triumph of the Revolution was yet to come, and this last battle would be fought not with cannons, muskets, and bayonets, but with speeches, promises, and, at the critical moment, a pair of reading glasses. This was the Newburgh Conspiracy. To understand the context for the Newburgh Conspiracy, we have to start a little earlier with a man named Robert Morris. In 1781, Congress appointed Morris to be the country's first superintendent of finance. The financial system he inherited was nothing short of a disaster. Congress owed money to France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and a laundry list of wealthy Americans. They were already behind on paying the salaries of the Continental Army, and every time they came up short of funds to buy supplies, the Army had to write new IOUs to local farmers just to feed themselves. To make matters worse, Congress had to rely on contributions from the states to finance the war. The problem was, the states were also broke, and shipping money across the country to Congress usually wasn't even close to their top priority. In desperation, Congress had printed their own money, but they'd printed so much of it that by 1781 the currency was essentially worthless. Morris didn't waste any time in his new position. He convinced Congress to create the Bank of North America to manage their finance, and in place of the worthless currency Congress had printed, he started issuing what are called Morris notes, which were backed not by the government, but by Morris's own personal credit, meaning that even if the government collapsed, Morris himself would be on the hook to pay these debts back. Even with these reforms, it was clear that there just wasn't enough money to go around. Morris met with George Washington to beg him to reduce expenses, but Washington insisted that the army absolutely needed to mount another major offensive in 1781. Morris couldn't help but ask, who was going to pay for it? The answer, it turned out, was the French. Another loan from the King of France arrived, along with news that the French fleet in the Caribbean was heading north to coordinate with the American army. With this money and a little creativity, Morris had just managed to scrape together enough supplies to keep Washington's troops fed and clothed as they marched south and laid siege to the British army at Yorktown. Their victory was as much a triumph for Morris as it was for Washington. Following the Battle of Yorktown, many Americans believed that the war was basically over. By the spring of 1782, news reached America that the British Prime Minister had resigned and that his replacement was expected to recognize American independence. Peace talks had already begun in Paris. Washington, however, had to prepare for the possibility that the war would continue. If that happened, the next step would be to drive the British Army from New York City. The Continental Army set up camp around 60 miles north of Manhattan, with Washington's headquarters at a town called Newburgh. While they planned and trained for an offensive that never materialized, the Army had another major concern on their minds. Back in 1780, in an attempt to keep people from resigning or deserting, Congress had approved lifetime pensions for officers in the Continental Army, meaning that after the war ended, they would continue to receive half of their army salary for the rest of their lives. Now, the war was drawing to a close, and Congress had no obvious way to even pay the Army's current salary, much less the pensions. When the officer corps looked to the future, they couldn't help wondering whether or not they'd ever actually see the money that had been promised to them. Now, Washington, of course, was acutely aware of his officers' concerns. However, he firmly believed that as commander-in-chief of the army, it would be dangerous for him to become personally involved in politics. The more the line blurred between military and political concerns, the greater the temptation became to use force to achieve political goals. In Washington's estimation, that road could only ever lead to tyranny, the very thing they were fighting this war to prevent. For now, Washington chose to remain above the fray and project absolute confidence that Congress would provide for his men when the time came. Congress, however, gave him little reason for optimism. In Philadelphia, debate over the pensions went round and round. Would the state's contributions cover the pensions? Should Congress give full responsibility for the pensions to the states and let them each pay their own officers? Should the pensions even be paid at all? Then, as now, Congress had a knack for making everything incredibly complicated, but Robert Morris believed that all of these financial problems had a simple solution. Everyone would get paid everything that they were owed, and the national government would do it without help from the states. All they had to do was create a nationwide impost, that is, a small tax on imports. Once they created the impost, Congress would finally have an income stream that didn't rely on the goodwill of the states or their foreign allies. That meant that the people they owed money to could be reasonably confident that payment was actually coming instead of just having to take Morris's word for it. The only problem was that Congress didn't have the authority to create taxes. Morris's plan required an amendment to the Articles of Confederation, a process that required approval from all 13 states. Luckily, Morris wasn't alone in this. There weren't formal political parties at this point, but Morris was one of a handful of politicians that historians call nationalists because they generally favored a stronger national government. This group also included James Madison, who had been working towards an Impost Amendment since the previous year. Alexander Hamilton would join them in Congress by the end of 1782. Washington also privately supported the nationalists, but like I mentioned, he kept those opinions out of the public arena. These nationalists worked tirelessly to secure approval for the Impost Amendment from all 13 states, but in the end, Rhode Island voted no. There was a brief campaign to change Rhode Island's mind, but by the end of the year, Virginia withdrew their approval as well, essentially killing the Impost Amendment for good. With the failure of one of the only serious proposals for how to fix the nation's finances, frustrations continue to grow on all sides, including in the army. In December, with Washington's permission but without his direct involvement, the officers sent a delegation to Philadelphia to petition Congress for their pensions in person. Congress agreed to hear the officers' concerns, but they were quickly overshadowed by two pieces of bombshell news. On January 22nd, on the same day Congress met to formally discuss the officers' petition, Robert Morris delivered the first bombshell, his intention to resign at the end of May. Superintendent of Finance was a terrible job, and if Congress and the states couldn't give him the power he needed to actually solve the country's financial problems, he saw no reason in continuing in office. Now, having your finance minister resign during a financial crisis is never really a good sign, but remember that one of the few things that was currently working about American finance was a system of bonds backed by Morris's personal credit. If he resigned, what little faith people had in the system might completely evaporate. Congress voted to keep the resignation secret until they had some idea of what would come next. The second bombshell came on February 13th. A ship arrived in Philadelphia carrying a rumor that the diplomats in Paris had reached a preliminary peace agreement that would formally recognize American independence. Now that was great news, but there was a downside to it. You see, everyone expected that as soon as the war ended, the army would disband and go home. For the officers, that meant that their time was running out to secure their pensions. If they went home without a firm commitment from Congress, there was a good chance the government would just conveniently forget to pay them, and there would be nothing any of them could do about it because they would be spread out across the country. Nationalists in Congress saw their window closing as well. They hoped to use the Army's discontent to put pressure on the government to do something, anything, to fix the country's finances. But they could only do that so long as the Army was still in the field. On the same day that the peace rumor reached Philadelphia, Alexander Hamilton wrote a letter to George Washington, venting his frustrations about Congress as, quote, a body not governed by reason or foresight, but by circumstances. He relayed a rumor he'd heard that the Army might refuse to disband if they didn't get paid, and suggested that Washington could use that growing discontent to advance the Army's cause with, quote, those weak minds which are influenced by their apprehensions more than their judgments. The trick was making sure that the Army didn't get out of hand, but Hamilton was confident that Washington was in a position to do just that. Washington's response made his opinion of these suggestions perfectly clear. It would, at this day, be productive of civil commotions and end in blood. God forbid we should be involved in it. The letter, however, ended optimistically. Washington believed there was no great risk of the Army exceeding the bounds of moderation, as Hamilton put it. He would soon learn that his optimism was misplaced. On March 10th, copies of an unsigned letter started circulating around camp. The letter urged the Army to take active steps to get their payment from Congress, even taking shots at Washington for failing to advocate for his men up to this point. Alarmingly, the letter advocated the very actions Washington had warned would end in blood, either refusing to disband if peace came, or, if the war continued, refusing to fight and leaving Congress and the American people to fend for themselves. The author also called for a meeting at 11 a.m. the next day to discuss specifics. Now, Washington could have just rounded up anyone who showed up to this meeting and court-martialed them, but instead he did something clever. As commander-in-chief, Washington sent out general orders to the entire army every morning. On March 11th, he stuck a note at the end of his regular orders, pointing out that it was highly irregular for some anonymous officer to call a staff meeting. Washington instead suggested that the officers meet on the 15th and send him a report on the proceedings, implying that he would not be present that day. This move accomplished two things. First, it gave Washington and his supporters a few extra days to figure out how they were going to respond. Secondly, by By rescheduling the meeting, Washington reminded everyone that they were still an army, they still had procedures to follow, and Washington was still in charge. On the 15th, the officers assembled to discuss their situation. These men had spent years fighting a war against the most powerful army in the world on behalf of a government that had failed them at almost every opportunity, and all they were asking for was the payment that they had been promised. Like Congress, the officers were divided over how to solve their problem, but at this meeting, armed mutiny was very much on the table, and the potential consequences of that mutiny cannot be overstated. Beyond the bloodshed Washington had predicted, there was a real possibility that if Congress couldn't even control the army, the states would give up on national government entirely, and the Union would dissolve before it even officially won its independence. The meeting came to order, but before the officers could even start talking, they heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. The door at the back of the room opened to reveal George Washington, asking to make some brief remarks before the discussion got going. Even the staunchest conspirators couldn't refuse him the opportunity to speak, so the commander-in-chief took the stage. Washington read a prepared speech that he and his trusted advisors had carefully crafted over the last few days. I'll read you two excerpts that I think give you a general sense of the argument. Washington began by directly addressing the anonymous letter. This dreadful alternative of either deserting our country in the extremest hour of her distress or turning our army against it has something so shocking in it that humanity revolts at the idea. My God, what can this writer have in view by recommending such measures? Can he be a friend to the army? Can he be a friend to this country? Rather, is he not an insidious foe? Washington went on to assure the officers of his faith in Congress, but he also made them a promise. If the army asked, he agreed to join the political fray and petition Congress on their behalf. Washington concluded by praising the army's character. If they exercised restraint and followed his advice, he said, "You will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings. And you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining." For any officers who weren't convinced, Washington had one more trick up his sleeve. He brought out a letter from Philadelphia that he said would demonstrate Congress's commitment to the army. He began to read, but he stumbled over the first few lines. He squinted at the paper for a moment. Then he set it down and reached into his pocket for a pair of reading glasses, his first pair, which almost no one had seen him wear yet. And then, in a rare moment of public vulnerability, the man who had become a living symbol of the revolution fumbled with them, like a fragile old man. He looked out at the officers and said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country." Every man in that room had suffered and sacrificed and risked their lives for the dream of an independent American republic, and Washington had been right there with them every step of the way. The accounts of men who were there tell us that this little gesture moved many of the officers to tears, and within the first 5 minutes of the meeting, the conspiracy had evaporated. Washington thanked his men and left the room, allowing his allies to guide the remainder of the discussion. In the end, the officers approved a series of resolutions reaffirming their loyalty to Congress and condemning the anonymous letter. They also asked Washington to write Congress on their behalf, which he would do 3 days later. If you're going to make the argument that America is an exceptional country because it was created by exceptional men, this is the moment that I think you should point to. The revolution, and potentially the country itself, were saved by an appeal to reason from a man whom everyone trusted to do what was right and to pursue the best interests of his men and his country. But before we get too excited about how amazing this event was, we should tell the rest of the story. By the end of March, the Army learned that Congress had ironed out a plan to pay them, not their full pensions, but a single lump sum equivalent to 5 years of salary. They would also receive back pay for a few months of their regular salary. However, Congress still didn't have the ability to pay them in hard currency. Their payment would come in the form of Morris notes, and As a reminder of how haphazard American finances still were, the notes were delayed because the printer in Philadelphia literally ran out of paper to print them on. The physical notes wouldn't show up in camp until most of the army had already left to return home. Those who did remain long enough to receive their Morris notes found themselves in a tough situation. Many couldn't even afford the cost of the trip home, and many would return home to find the economy in shambles and their families deeply in debt. Morris's promises couldn't put food in their bellies or keep debt collectors from taking their farms, so many soldiers sold the notes to anyone who was willing to pay cash. This often meant taking 40 to 50 cents on the dollar from wealthy New York merchants who were willing to take on the risk that Morris might never pay in exchange for the chance of doubling their money. To add insult to injury, in the 1790s when Alexander Hamilton was restructuring the nation's finances, he shot down a plan to ensure that some of the debt payments would go to the soldiers who originally earned them. While Hamilton acknowledged that some of them sold their bonds because they had to, he also argued that some of them sold because they just didn't have sufficient faith in the United States, or because they were trying to turn a profit. Because he had no easy way to know for sure who sold for what reason, Hamilton just gave the full payments to the current debt holders, many of whom just so happened to be his political supporters. So, with all of that in mind, what should we take away from this story? Why should we care about this 200 plus years later? I'll give you 3 main points. Number 1, George Washington really did save the day here. If the army had actually mutinied against Congress, there was a serious risk of the country falling apart mere months before the Treaty of Paris could be ratified. Washington's actions kept the fledgling nation intact long enough to end the war and limp through a few more years until they could eventually write and ratify the Constitution. But that actually leads into the second point, which is that Washington's speech really only treated a symptom without addressing the underlying problem. Sure, the mutiny wasn't going to happen, but the actual root cause, the fact that the government's finances were a complete train wreck, that problem was still there, and it would flare up into actual violence 3 years later in the form of Shays' Rebellion. It wasn't until the early 1790s when the new national government finally secured sources of revenue and sorted out how they were going to pay their debts that this problem really went away. As we follow modern politics, and really in life in general, we should ask ourselves whether we're actually addressing the root causes of our problems or just putting a band-aid over them and hoping we'll have a better solution the next time they come up. Finally, point number 3. Although Washington made his appeal to the officers based on the idea that he had taken part in the same sacrifice and suffering that the rest of the army had, when you look at what happened at the end of the war, it's pretty obvious that the suffering wasn't evenly distributed. Like I mentioned earlier, many enlisted men and low-level officers returned home to financial ruin at the end of the war. Washington, on the other hand, returned home to a successful plantation, where hundreds of enslaved people had been working the fields in his absence. He even stopped off in upstate New York to buy 6,000 acres of land just because he thought it would be a good investment. It's very easy to look at history as the story of great men and big ideas, but realistically, almost everyone who has ever lived was just a regular person. If we're going to use history as a way to understand why our world is the way it is, and how we can make it better for ourselves and our families and our communities, we have to talk about the way these events affected regular people, and how that drove history just as much as, if not more than, those great men and big ideas. So yeah, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. This is obviously a different style of video than what I normally do. This style is basically my imitation of a channel called Historia Civilis. I think they are one of the best history channels on YouTube. If you're interested in Greco-Roman history, definitely check them out. They also have a recent series about the Congress of Vienna, which is phenomenal if you want to learn more about the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But anyway, my plan is to go back to the regular style of videos after this. Chapter 7 is up next, so hopefully I'll see you then.